Welcome back to another episode of the Property Management Show, where we deep dive into the world of property management, marketing, and entrepreneurship. I'm your host, Marie Tepman from 4.5 Marketing Agency, fresh out of maternity leave. 4.5 is focused on helping property managers get more owner leads through marketing, whether you need help with your website, SEO, online reputation, blog content, may that be written or video, paid advertising, you name it, we can help you. Visit our website 4andhalf.com to learn more. That's FOURANDHALF.com. Okay, so this podcast, I feel like needs a little bit of context before we start. So shortly before I went on maternity leave, I started noticing some water marks, water damage type things on our ceiling, right? So naturally, my husband and I tried to contact roofers to have them come and make an assessment. And at the end of that whole thing, we had them do bids. We were very confused, right? So we got very contradictory assessments to the issue and very contradictory recommendations on how to fix it, and very, very different price points in the bidding. And that whole process took about 3 months. It really dragged on, right? And so we were kind of like not sure which vendor to trust, which vendor to believe, because we're not roofers ourselves. And it just so happened that during this time, I met RoDevia Brigham from Proposabid, who is today's podcast guest. And, RoDevia basically helped me understand that what I was experiencing was not a fluke, and that this vendor bidding process thing is actually riddled with a lot of inefficiencies and challenges. And that if I, a sole property owner, is dealing with so much issues with just my problem, my small problem, could you imagine a property manager, a property management company having to deal with this for a much wider portfolio, right? And so, of course, I had to invite RoDevia on the podcast as soon as I got back, to work. And that's exactly what I did. And so here is part 1 of my conversation with RoDevia to talk about the vendor bidding process. Enjoy. It's been a long time since we put out another episode, and I'm so excited to start it off today with none other than RoDevia Brigham from Proposabid. Welcome to the show. I think it's your first time, right?
Yes, Marie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited because the topic today of our discussion is something I don't think we've covered before on the podcast, and it relates to vendor bidding, which, granted, that was a new concept to me, that there's this whole industry related to vendor bidding before I met you. And so to start us off, can you introduce yourself to our audience and what you do and how you even got to this industry?
Yes, thank you, Marie. It's good to be here. My name is RoDevia Brigham with Proposabid. I'm the founder and CEO. And what we do is bids and estimations for property repairs across the United States. And our niche is property management companies, real estate investors, mom and dads, and folks that really don't know how to go about sourcing those bids on their own. And the way we got started was a shower moment. My background is in computer science and IT, specifically cybersecurity. And I have an if this, then that kind of thought process. And how can I automate things? And in the shower, I was asking my partner if she could automate anything in her day-to-day in property management, what would it be? She said, if I could just get good bids, apples for apples, on time, the vendors pick up the phone and they submit things that are relevant to the work that needs to be done, that I could submit them to property owners so they can make financially relevant decisions, that would be great. And not knowing that I took that seriously, and she took that passively as it's an everyday problem for clients. Here we are 3.5, 4 years later, and doing the work that needs to be done.
Great. And, it's so fascinating when you stumble upon a problem that seems to be small, but it actually is big. And so let's talk about that problem, right? So when we first met, you told me that the vendor bidding process in property management is essentially broken, right? Which I didn't even think it was a thing. I thought like, oh no, property managers, know their vendors. They already, have great relationship with their vendors. Why would they even need bidding? Anyway, they had this down pat, but I was so wrong. Can you talk to our audience about that process and, why I think it's broken?
Well, the process typically is what is high level, which is you contact three companies, you get three different prices, you get a proposal, and then you select the lowest bidder, right? And that's typically what happens. But in that process, there are some key items there that your on-site staff who might not be familiar in getting those bids are able to do. And first, it starts with the phone calls and the emails, right? And the back and forth. Then it's the hurry up and waits for those bids. Those bids may come in, immediately, take a couple of weeks, or you might not have vendors that will respond anyway. Once those bids come in, you have to do comparables, right? Are they apples for apples? Do they have the right warranties? Are there any considerations or concessions that need to be made? Is the price right? Is the scope of work correct? Um, are the vendors even qualified to do the work? Are they within a verifiable database for licensing and insurance, right? So once you get those comparables, then you may need to make corrections to those. So then you're back at the emails, the phone calls, the text messages, the different streams of communication, the hurry up and wait, the incoming bids, recompare. And then once you have those corrections that are all the way done and within the time frame and the specifications that the property might want, then you can go ahead and submit those bids, right, to your property owner or to the property management company. And then they go ahead and award the vendor. That process in and of itself could take a couple of weeks to a couple of months to maybe never even getting done. And, there's some key roles there that happens for clients. And those key roles are probably your directors, your asset managers, your office managers, your maintenance folks who are taking those bids and they're looking at these bids and making those phone calls and those hurry up and waits for about 10 hours each week, right? And when these time frames are added up, it could, cost anywhere from about 400 to 520 hours per year to never get the bids done by looking at the vendors themselves. And with that, that time allocation could be utilized in other resources. So financially, it actually translates to an annual cost of almost about 30 to 40 grand that's lost purely on the bid management side of, never having the repairs done, the roofing, the asphalt, the SB 721s if you're in the state of California, the mold remediation, things like that. So now consider what that looks like across multiple or entire platforms, right? So that's just one property that's trying to source bids. Got your on-site staff that's trying to collect rent. They're going to court, right? They're dealing with the residents. Now they have to go out and source bids for roofing that they're not experts in. So with that, there's also the issue of like standardizations from the vendors. If you don't have a request for proposal, then how do you get to attract the right vendors, right? If you don't have the correct qualified information, you don't have project requirements, the direct comparables, then staff isn't really able to close on those bids either. And then you also have a limited reach. So if you're making phone calls and emails and those vendors aren't responding, then you have that long time allocation there where those resources are being wasted or your bids are expiring or now you're into fines, fees, and penalties because you're supposed to have inspections done. You're supposed to have that permit that was set up by the vendor. And now you're in this phase of hurry up and just choose the first bid that comes along, which might not be the correct bid at the right price. And with that, you also have a lack of transparency in which, if you don't have the right vendors in place and you don't have the right RFPs in place, then that means that you don't have the right transparency in place and you're going ahead, you're just getting the only bids that you can to save face for the client. And that is not the best thing to do. So all those things were taken into consideration when uh, building out, the thought process of the client. I have two clients, which is the vendors themselves and also property and the owners. And what is it that each side needs? So that's the part that's broken. And I think that what really needs to be shored up is taking that responsibility off the plates of the properties themselves and taking that responsibility and putting it on a third party that can actually take the time, and that's all they do. So therefore you're able to allocate your time and resources to some of the most the other pertinent aspects of property management.
Yeah, so what it sounds like is the the bidding process requires a lot of project management and also knowledge in terms of, how do you ensure you're getting the correct types of bids that will actually address the problem? And are you getting a fair price for them, right? And you're not being price gouged or they're not putting unnecessary work in the scope. Um, and this are all really interesting things because, like you were saying, right? Like the property managers, if you put this on their plate, can do they really have the bandwidth because they're already dealing with other property management related stuff, right? And it's one of those things where like the bidding happens for bigger ticket items. So it's not an everyday thing to merit hiring a full-time person just handling the bids, right? Because it's like you typically have like maintenance coordinators that are in charge of communicating with the day-to-day maintenance and preventative maintenance. But I feel like, just to clarify with the audience, what you're talking about are like the larger projects right?
So these projects are basically anything that requires three bids or more, such as insurance claims, or you have projects that are tenant based, right? So these are things that may be in the 50, 60, $70,000 mark, all the way up to what we've recently done was a $3.5 million mark. In that, you have your on-site preventative maintenance, you have your property, maintenance that does that particular aspect, but he's not a roofer, right? He is a general maintenance person and he's keeping your property together. But then when you have such as inspections reports, right? Or you have, you need to lay asphalt or concrete, or you need to get adjustable arms for your property, right? For that in and out egress and for parking and things like that. Those things are to be sourced. Now, your on-site staff can do the sourcing that they need to do. However, what we're looking for, just like with any property, is efficiency. So if the efficiency isn't there, then you will have that gap in acquiring the resources that you need to be able to close out that inefficiency. So it's dependent on the property when they would use three bids or more. And with property management, it's budget season, it's capital improvements. Those things are very important. It's not also just getting the bids and doing the work. It's to have magnitude of orders. Basically, what you need is bids to be able to make decisions on future requirements that are needed on the property. And who has time to do that, right? You're just now getting the numbers in, and you have to have the bids to back them up. Typically, that's what ownership wants, or that's what property management wants. Who's sourcing those? Hopefully somebody. So we are, you would think that the properties would have multifaceted streams of being able to source, the repairs that they need. Typically, they don't. So it depends on the property itself. What we, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for that clarification. Were you about to tell a story?
Probably, but I've got plenty of stories where we can get to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I kind of wanted our audience to get some numbers that I know you shared in a recent webinar to kind of make it more concrete, kind of like the kind of time wasted and inefficiencies that are present in this, in this seemingly small part of the process.
Yeah.
Can you give some examples of, numbers that you've pulled together?
Yeah, so one of the things that is really interesting is that 30% of vendors actually only submit a proposal when they're being sourced. So out of a pool of 100%, only 30% are submitting that, right? And so why is it that when properties are calling vendors, they're non-responsive? That's basically what we're getting to. And part of it has to do with no RFP to show for, or an incomplete or vague RFP. So basically, you have no information to work on as a vendor, so you're not going to submit bids. There might be resource constraints, meaning that there's lack of time for that vendor to be able to respond to any bids at all. And there's also, they may be focused on uh, more bids that have a higher quality, higher dollar amount, better neighborhoods. Also, vendors tend not to submit to properties that have a poor reputation.
Oh.
Right. So let's say this is something I've learned in the business. You had a roofing project that you needed to have done. You went ahead and sourced out 2.5 years ago for 4 or 5 roofers. They all submitted bids to you, and now 3.5 years, 4 years later, you're re-asking for bids from these same folks. So that property may have a poor reputation on not awarding the vendor. So
Mhm.
vendors, the more you source for bids and don't award, the less likely you'll have those bids to be award to be able to award to and have high quality bids to be submitted. And then so in that it creates a lack of trust in the relationship, and basically what you'll have is fishing expeditions. So
Mhm.
that's why vendors are less likely to submit proposals to properties who they deem is not worthy, and less likely to invest time in preparing those proposals to begin with.
Mhm.
And then there's also a really fun fact that, you know, some bids may come in, as a vary as much as 150%. Now, parts of that is either contractor overhead, or it could be the market conditions, or it could be the bidding strategy, right? So for the contractor overhead, you have insurance, right? Insurance is going up. I had to get insurance and it's going up. You have office space and you have labor. So if a contractor has high administrative costs, it could cost up to an additional 30 to 50% on the markup on the bids, while other leaner operations might only charge 10 to 20%. So with that, you will have discrepancies in the bid themselves, and that's just on the administrative side. That's not even the labor and the cost there. But then there's also market conditions, right? Based on the demand, labor shortage, materials, scarcity, inflation. So we can get into that later. So in a tight, labor market, a contractor might charge, 20 to 30% more to account for the increase of their costs and their
Mhm.
subcontractors. While this also a slower season. So if you get bids in November in Wisconsin for roofing, it's
Mhm.
probably going to be cheaper than bids in spring.
Mhm.
Right. So there might be a 5 to 10% margin, or 10 to 15% competitive margin there. And then it's the bidding strategies that go along with it. If you're going with larger, established firms, there might be a 20 to 40% buffer there. Or with some other smaller, newer entrants, it might be 5 to 10% margin to be competitive with what's going on out in the bidding world. Uh, there's some other there's some other uh, numbers that I could give you too, but those are the top two that I was kind of looking at.
Yeah, so it's really surprising when I heard that the bids can vary up to like 150%. Like that's a big difference, especially that these are big ticket projects.
So yeah, and I would tell a story. I'll let you tell a story, but when I looked at some of the bids that you received, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, when you helped me source some vendors to take care of some mold issues at home, which at first we thought was like a roof issue. My husband tried to source, roofer bids, and that took about a quarter, and only two of them submitted bids, and even the bids were vastly different.
The 150.
And then we found out like, wait, we actually don't need to address the roof. We first need to figure out like how big the mold problem is. And yeah, we were able to get like I think 7 bids in a span of a few days. And then I was appalled at how big the discrepancy was on the pricing. And at
Mhm.
first glance, initially I was looking at like the price, like this is how much we're going to charge for the project. And then I think with your help, I was able to create like a matrix to compare like how much they were charging for the inspection, and then these were the add-ons like testing fee, whatever. And then when I actually looked at the matrix, one of the vendors that seemed the most expensive was actually the cheapest because it's all inclusive compared to the others that looked cheaper, but everything else was at add-on cost.
Mhm.
Um, and so my project was not that expensive. My house is small.
Mhm.
Um, and I can just imagine for a property management company sourcing a project for an apartment complex, 150% variance in bids is a big deal. Like how, right? Like how do you even, maybe it's a good segue. Like when the bids are all over the place, how do you even make sense of, well, do I just go with the cheapest bid? Right? Like, is that how you choose?
So it depends on who's spending the money,
Mm,
right? And it also depends on what do you value. So what we, the specialization should be getting those bids apples for apples. And the way you do that is with the request for proposal, right? It's the dog whistle that gets the clear information and communication to attract the right vendors. And with that, it's not necessarily the cheapest price, but it's also what is it that, what is it that the client values? Is it
mhm,
the expertise? Is it the certifications? Is it the communication? Things like that. So with the price discrepancies there, you would want to source at least 5 to 7 bids. That
mhm,
is extremely difficult in this business. And the way you're able to do that is by having the correct RFP in place, along with the sequential cadence on contacting the vendors and giving them what they need. May they be photos, drawings, blueprints, floor plans, previous tests, recommendations from the state or the city, things like that. And when you receive those bids, as you experienced, you received 8 bids, right? Clients typically should receive 5 to 7 bids. You want to take your top 4 bids that are apples for apples, that have the correct warranties, pricing specs, the itemization, what they do and will not do, right? The exclusions, the
mhm. Yeah.
inclusions, things like that. Grid that out. This is without a system, right? Like
Mhm,
Proposabid in place, and then do the comparisons from there on top of how did the vendor make me feel, right? And that's where that single
mhm,
family residency comes in, mom and pop that don't have the time. And then also for property management, how did the vendor show up? They show up on
mhm,
time. Did they give you accurate information? Were they kind? Things like that. That's that customer service piece. So it depends on what does the client value. If they're just looking for the lowest price, well, if all the bids are within the same requirements, then it's not about the lowest price anymore. It's about who's spending the money and what is the end result. Is it long-term quality and value over, immediate need, right? Like you got to
Mm-hmm.
get this done now because we're going to get
Yeah.
a lawsuit, right? Or it's just aesthetic and for
Mm.
longevity. So that's kind of hard to answer because,
It depends.
it depends. Yeah.
And so I think that's a good segue to something else I really wanted to cover, which is scope of work. So you were mentioning
Mhm.
RFPs, which is basically scope of work, right? Is
Well,
that
the
accurate?
RFP is the request. Scope of
Request.
work is how to do it. So you
Oh,
can you
okay.
can package in an RFP, right? So for instance, right, with the mold, we created an RFP based on the intake that we did. And
Mhm.
then from the test results, that was the scope. Like
Mhm.
you need to do these particular things. So you can
Mhm.
package those things together and then market it to the vendor, which we did.
Mhm.
Right.
And so for our property management, listeners, how important is a rock solid scope of work, in the bidding process?
Yeah. So it's extremely important, and property management companies don't have that resource. For every property management company or single property that I've worked with, a RFP was never created to source the original bids. And then we step in and we create that RFP. So it creates clarity. You get apples to apples comparisons. And those two particular things are really what uh, makes the bids viable for the property to make financially relevant decisions, because there's not a need for back and forth in the clarifications. It saves times in the evaluation process. You're able to clearly define the project goals and requirements and expectations, which reduces the misunderstandings, and that the vendor fully understands what is needed. And this transparency, the RFP is the first thing that builds trust. It's like a handshake,
Mm.
right? You look a person in the eye and you shake their hand. So how does that make you feel? When the vendor receives that RFP, they're like, okay, I know. They can say no, right? They can
Yes.
automatically say no, I'm not interested in this, I don't have time for this. Or yes, I just need some more information. And in this, you attract the right vendor with quality and higher quality bids. And
Mhm.
when you have that RFP and then they go on site, now
Mhm.
we experienced some vendors will give a quote and a bid without ever being on site, and
Yeah.
they were in that lower three,
Yeah.
right? Because we got 8,
Yeah.
and they weren't in your top 4.
Yeah.
So with the apples to apples comparisons, vendors are able to submit comparable proposals that have the accurate pricing and timelines, because sometimes, the big comparisons can be skewed, and it leads to potential misalignment and unanticipated costs if you don't have an RFP. The other thing about an RFP is that it's a foundation for the properties to work off of when your team members uh, move to another department.
Mhm.
So instead of starting all over, you just pull that document, you pull that RFP when Sally comes on and she's the new asset manager and there's no director on site.
There's
Or
also a paper trail,
there's
right?
a
If
paper
the
trail.
owners come back to you and be like, I think, you didn't pick a good vendor or something. It's like, or you didn't include XYZ. It's like, we worked with you on the scope of work. This is the scope. And so, what are the components of a good scope of work?
Yeah, so you have an executive summary, project scope and requirements, timeline and milestones, budget and cost constraints, right? Evaluation criteria, which is like compliance and regulations, that can influence how the vendor moves about submission instructions. How do you get the bids in? What is the time frame? What is the dateline? Then there's vendor qualifications and experiences, especially when you're pulling from a database such as Compliance
Mm-hmm.
Depot, Nexus, or Vive. You can include that scope of work on top of the RFP, and then there's legal compliance requirements along with that, and then how to contact and any Q&A protocols that might be. So that's what you would use in your core competency of an RFP. But some of the things that some of the repercussions for skipping an RFP can be like misaligned expectations, increased project delays, difficulty comparing the bids. You can get higher costs and budget overruns. You can also damage your relationship with the vendors because there's a lack of structure, and therefore it seems like you're uncommitted when there's not an RFP involved. That also can create transparency, and what we've done is that we've made it fraud detection also.
Wait, did RoDevia really say fraud? Stay tuned for part 2, where we continue this conversation. We will also talk about common issues with collecting and analyzing bids from vendors, as well as go over some future trends to watch out for. Now, make sure you are subscribed to our YouTube channel, our newsletter, to make sure that you are not going to miss out on part 2 of our discussion. As a reminder, this podcast is brought to you by 4.5 Marketing Agency. 4.5 is focused on helping you get more owner leads for your property management business. Go to 4andhalf.com to learn more. That's FOURANDHALF.com. Thank you, and see you next time.